I think the best way to answer that question is to talk about the relationship between liberalism on one hand and nationalism and realism on the other hand. I think talking about those three ideologies and how they relate to each other tells you a lot about what went wrong. Uh, as I said when we were talking about NATO expansion into Ukraine, the Russians were thinking as realists, and the Americans and their European allies were thinking as liberals. And when you put realism up against liberalism, realism wins every time. Uh, Furthermore, when you put nationalism up against liberalism, nationalism wins every time. It's very important to understand that liberal hegemony was all about interfering in the politics of other countries for the main purpose of turning them into liberal democracies. You just want to think about this. Liberal hegemony was all about spreading liberalism across the planet, creating a globe that was populated by nothing but liberal democracies. You remember when the Cold War ends, Francis Fukuyama writes this very famous article called The End of History. And the Fukuyama argument basically says that we in the West defeated fascism in the first half of the 20th century, communism in the second half of the 20th century, and the future is all liberalism. States are going to turn into liberal democracies and in an inexorable way. This is why Frank concludes at the end of his essay that the future is going to be boring. It's going to be boring because the world is populated by liberal democracies. Well, what that does is it leaves the United States to think that it can spread liberal democracy all over the planet, and oftentimes at the end of a rifle barrel. But the problem is that nationalism is going to get in the way because nation states, that's the embodiment of the concept of nationalism. Nation states resist other states interfering in their politics and telling them what kind of political system they can have. So you have the United States going into the Middle East with the Bush Doctrine for the express purpose of turning the Middle East into a sea of liberal democracies. We're basically saying we can go in to the Middle East and we can interfere in the politics of sovereign states and we can turn them into liberal democracies because liberal democracy is the best possible political order for everybody. And furthermore, Frank Fukuyama tells us that this is inevitable anyway. Well, when you think like that, it's not long before you run up against nationalism. And nationalism is where countries say, we are sovereign states and we'll decide what kind of political system we have. And we don't want you invading our country and telling us what to do. So, in a very important way, you see that this liberal foreign policy ran up against realism and it ran up against nationalism because this liberal foreign policy involves, right, pushing other countries around in ways that might violate their security. And furthermore, and that's where the realism comes in, and furthermore, it calls for interfering in the domestic politics. It calls for challenging the sovereignty of other states. And that brings nationalism into play. And the best example, just very quickly to highlight this, is China. The United States adopted a policy of engagement towards China. Engagement is just another way of saying liberal hegemony. What was the United States trying to do with China? What we wanted to do was we wanted to turn China into a liberal democracy. We went to great lengths to help it grow economically. We wanted to get it hooked on capitalism. We wanted to foster economic interdependence between China and other countries. Furthermore, we wanted to integrate China into international institutions like the World Trade Organization. And the widespread belief, Glenn, was that China would eventually become a liberal democracy. And once it became a liberal democracy, we would all live happily ever after. But you have to put yourself in the shoes of Chinese leaders in Beijing. First of all, they don't want the United States turning China into a liberal democracy. The Chinese believe that they'll decide what kind of political system they will have, and they don't want the American political system. They don't want liberal democracy. So you get resistance from China to this liberal hegemony that's based on nationalism. And then furthermore, there's the realist dimension to this. The Chinese, much like the Russians, unsurprisingly fear American military power. They fear the Unipole. And as China gets richer, unsurprisingly, it turns its economic might into military might. Now, all of these liberal hegemonists in the West say, why are the Chinese doing that? They have nothing to fear from the United States. The United States is a benign hegemon. Well, if you're sitting in Beijing, just like if you're sitting in Moscow or you're sitting in Baghdad, the United States doesn't look like a benign hegemon. It looks like a serious threat. Again, you see realist logic kicking in, and you see nationalism kicking in. The idea that we are sovereign states and we don't want the United States telling us how to do business. As you know, when people start talking about the Russians getting involved in an American election, the whole Russiagate business, which of course was not true, but Americans talked about Russian interference in the 2016 election. This enraged Americans. Why? Because we thought the Russians were violating American sovereignty. I want to be clear, they weren't, right? This is all a myth. But let's assume the myth was true. The belief was that they were violating our sovereignty. This is unacceptable. This is nationalism at play. It's nationalism inside the United States. Well, unsurprisingly, other countries around the world think in the same way. So the bottom line, Glenn, is that we adopted, when the Cold War ended, this policy of liberal hegemony, which was basically a liberal theory of how to deal with the world. And it ran into realism and nationalism, and it ultimately failed.
I think it's important what you said there, that because it's not as if it's liberal democracies only West and the rest of the world are nationalist, that this is also within the West, that is the United States, and also has nationalism. So it is, and I think ignoring this is also part of the reason why we have this populist revolt now. But again, this liberal delusion, I think this is why, well, at the moment, Beijing is watching NATO in war with Russia. They're watching the attack on Iran. And still, it's argued that they should not fear anything, that we're all benign. It seems a bit like crazy town for them, but I guess, that hits the core.
Yeah, if I can make one more point, Glenn, just on your comment about the fact that the Americans were thinking very much like nationalists. What's interesting is that during the unipolar moment, when we were pursuing this liberal foreign policy, there was all sorts of evidence that we were thinking very much according to the logic of nationalism, although we would never acknowledge this. And the best example of this is Madeleine Albright and her famous or infamous comment that the United States is the indispensable nation, that we stand taller and we see further. If you think about that, and remember, Madeleine Albright is a liberal of the first order. I mean, if there's anybody who embodies liberal hegemony, it's got to be Madeleine Albright. But at the same time, she's a first order nationalist. Listen to what she's saying. We, meaning the United States, we are the indispensable nation. There's the word, nation, nationalism. We stand taller. We see further. This is the chauvinism that invariably lies at the heart of any nationalism, right? Virtually every country believes that it is the chosen people, right? We are the city on the hill, right? That's nationalism. So here you have Madeleine Albright, right? This card carrying liberal who's also a card carrying nationalist. And what Madeleine Albright is that she's a liberal nationalist. This is a term that we used to use when I was in graduate school to describe Max Weber. He was a liberal nationalist, right? Madeleine Albright is a liberal nationalist, but she does not understand, or she did not understand, the nationalist dimension of her identity. She didn't understand that she was a nationalist and that others in the world think in terms of nationalism as well as liberalism. So that means you have to be extremely careful when you start talking about interfering in the politics of other countries, because nationalism, again, is such a powerful force.
I guess it's a danger of ignoring realism because I think it was Raymond Aron. He wrote in the 1960s that the idealist, believing that he has broken with power politics, exaggerates its crimes, and this is when you have the liberal assumption fueled with the realist or nationalist realities. And yeah, I think it's very relevant to see the conflicts which we're involved in today.
Well, the thing is, Glenn, just building on your point, most people think that realists are warmongers, right? This gets back to your point about social constructivists who see realists as the principal cause of all our troubles in the world. And if only the realists would go away, we'd live happily ever after. The fact is that realists like you and realists like me and realists like George Kennan and realists like Raymond Aron have a very healthy sense of the limits of power. That's why we would not have favored NATO expansion into Ukraine. And we would have avoided this giant catastrophe that we're now facing, because realists understand, yes, power matters, but there are limits to what you can do in international politics because other states will balance against you. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to cut in the other direction. It's the whole idea that we, the Americans, we, the West, we're the good guys. We can expand here, there, and everywhere, and people will understand that we're benign because we're liberal. And they, liberals, do not have a healthy sense of the limits of military power, and they end up pursuing a very ambitious agenda to boot. You want to remember that liberal hegemony is all about turning the entire planet into a body of states that look like the United States. That's our goal. We want to make everybody look like us, and we're willing to do it at the end of a rifle barrel. This is going to end up with a lot of forever wars. This is very foolish. And of course, realists argue against that. So my bottom line here is that you'd have fewer wars if realists were in charge than when liberals were in charge. And furthermore, with regard to Ukraine, if the realists had been in charge, Ukraine would be fully intact today, in all likelihood, inside its pre-2014 borders. But instead, the country is now a dysfunctional rump state and is going to remain a dysfunctional rump state because the West and the Ukrainians did not act according to realist logic.
Professor Mearsheimer, thank you so much. It's no, I think it's very important insights, because I even have debates with people these days, and I ask, if we could go back to 2014, not pursue this regime change in Ukraine, so they would have kept all their population, Crimea, avoid this war. Should we have done it? It's like, well, it was the right thing to do. So, so I think this is begs the question. Yeah, well, perhaps it would have been much more peaceful if the realists would have decided that politics back then. So, thanks again for your time and letting me pick your brain.
My pleasure, Glenn. I enjoyed it thoroughly.